My son and his wife told me there wasn't room for me on the family trip, even though I was the one who raised him in that house, paid for every birthday, every graduation, every Sunday dinner. So I waited, quietly. And when they came back, the house was no longer theirs to come home to. This is the story of what happens when a mother stops waiting to be invited and starts choosing herself. If you've ever felt pushed aside by the people you love most, stay with me. This story might be yours too. My name is Elaine Rourke, and I live in the same beige colonial I've called home for nearly 40 years. It has a creaky front step, a crooked mailbox my husband swore he'd fix but never did, and a kitchen window that lets in a golden slant of afternoon light that makes everything, even the old linoleum floor, feel like home. This house isn't big, but it holds generations of memories etched into every doorframe and drawer pull. I've been a widow for 6 years now. Howard passed on a rainy Thursday morning in March. Stroke. Quick, the doctor said. I was the one who found him. Still in his gardening shoes, the ones with the little crack in the heel. He had been pruning the hydrangeas. I think about that detail too often. That he died with his hands still in the dirt doing something simple and beautiful. That in the end he didn't suffer long. But in the days that followed, I realized I would. Howard was my partner for 42 years. He was steady good with numbers, loved a bad pun. He whistled in the mornings and believed in using real butter. He also believed deeply in family rituals, especially Sunday dinners. People can drift, he'd say, but a shared meal is a string that pulls everyone back to the center. After he was gone, I made it my mission to keep that string from fraying. Every Sunday I cooked the same meal: broiled salmon with garlic herb butter, roasted asparagus, wild rice pilaf, and a lemon tart for dessert. Not because I lack imagination, though maybe I do, but because it's what my grandchildren like. Or used to. James always said the rice was fancy like a restaurant, and Chloe once told her teacher that her grandma's salmon was better than anyone's, even Gordon Ramsay's. She'd only seen Gordon Ramsay on YouTube, but the compliment stuck. Sunday mornings start early for me. I tie back my hair with the blue scarf Howard bought me at a church rummage sale. I turn on the radio, usually the oldies station, and start chopping mixing tasting. The kitchen fills with the smell of lemon and garlic, and for a little while it feels like the house is still full. I even set the table in advance, 4 place settings and 1 more just in case. Always with cloth napkins, the floral ones we bought together in 1987 from a Sears outlet. I iron them on Saturday nights. Old habits. Garrett, my son, is 38 now. He was my only child. Our little miracle after 3 miscarriages and a fertility doctor who once told me to just accept fate. Garrett was born on a Tuesday morning in June. I remember because Howard missed a staff meeting and said he'd never been so happy to get in trouble. Garrett was quiet as a baby, thoughtful as a boy, and grew into a man who kept his feelings under lock and key. But I always thought I had a key to that lock. Maybe I was wrong. He married Nicole 10 years ago. She's a pediatric clinic coordinator. She's efficient, organized, and always just a little too tired. I don't think she dislikes me. I just don't think she sees me. I used to try harder. Small gifts, offering help, asking about her work. But over time I learned to stay in the polite, neutral territory where our relationship lives. We orbit each other occasionally, nodding across the same room. They have 2 children. James is 11 now. He's growing into his father's lanky frame and already towers over the kitchen island. He's obsessed with space robots and Fortnite. He used to help me stir the rice. Now he brings his tablet to dinner and pretends not to hear me ask how school's going. Chloe, on the other hand, still has a sparkle. She brings me doodles, insists on helping set the table, and once corrected my pronunciation of gnocchi with the seriousness of a diplomat. They live about 20 minutes away in a townhouse with a postage stamp yard and stainless steel everything. Close enough for pop-ins, though they never pop in. Their visits are scheduled predictable. Every Sunday at 4:30 p.m. They pull into the driveway. I know the sound of their tires on the gravel by heart. I always check my lipstick in the mirror at 4:25. Last Sunday began like all the others. I was up at 7 cleaning the baseboards. No one sees, checking the fridge 3 times to make sure the tart had set. I added a mint leaf to the center this time just because the sun was bright. The radio played Moon River, and for a moment I let myself imagine it was 1996 and Howard was just out back pulling weeds in his too short cargo shorts. At 4:31 p.m. and right on cue I heard the car. James burst in first, already asking for the Wi-Fi password even though he's known it for years. Chloe hugged me and asked if I had any strawberries. She always asks even when it's December. Nicole walked in last, adjusting her sunglasses on top of her head, saying, "Smells nice in here," like she was complimenting a scented candle. Garrett hugged me with one arm and looked past me into the living room. "Hey, Mom. How are things?" "Things are good," I said, which is what I always say. Dinner was quiet. I tried to spark conversation. Mentioned a documentary I'd watched on sea otters, asked James about science class, Chloe about her new ballet class. But the answers were short distracted. Nicole checked her phone twice. Garrett said he had a lot going on at work. I nodded, smiled past the asparagus. Midway through the meal, I caught Nicole sneaking a glance at her phone under the table. She nudged Garrett and whispered, "Are we still stopping by Tanya's after this?" He nodded without looking up. That was the moment I felt it. That pinch, that small tear inside that lets in cold air. I had no idea they had plans after dinner. It wasn't the change of schedule that stung. It was that I didn't matter enough to be told. I finished my meal in silence. Chloe didn't want dessert. James took his to go, claiming he had a thing online. Nicole offered to help clear the table, but I declined. They left at 6:02 p.m. Garrett kissed my cheek, said, "Thanks, Mom. As always." And I stood in the hallway as they pulled away, Chloe waving from the back seat like a child leaving summer camp. I turned off the porch light and shut the door. The house once again settled into its hush. I walked back into the kitchen, took a breath, and looked around. The chairs sat askew. Crumbs littered the placemats. The flowers had begun to droop. I stared at Howard's chair, still pushed in neatly at the head of the table. I haven't let anyone sit there since he passed. Maybe that's strange, but it's a line I've never been willing to erase. I scraped plates into the trash and started the dishwasher. The lemon tart sat untouched on the counter, the mint leaf browning at the edges. I slid it into the fridge anyway. Old habits. That night in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours. I thought about the moment Nicole asked about Tanya's. The way Garrett didn't meet my eyes. The way they left so easily. The way everything once held together by love and salmon now felt flimsy and pre-written. Howard used to say, when they stop asking for seconds, maybe it's time to feed yourself. I never understood what he meant. I think now I do. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad, really. Just untethered. They still showed up. They still ate the food. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. I no longer felt like the reason they came. And for the first time, I wondered, what if I wasn't? It was the following Sunday, and everything looked the same on the surface. The salmon was still pink and perfectly broiled. The lemon tart still gleamed with its sugared top. Chloe still asked for strawberries and still found none. James still slouched over his plate like the dining table was just another desk he couldn't wait to leave. Nicole still smiled that thin, polite smile. And Garrett still offered me his usual one-armed hug like a formality you get used to rather than a warmth you look forward to. But something was different. Or maybe I had begun to see it differently. We were halfway through dinner, the clink of forks, and the occasional cough the only sounds in the room. I had tried asking Chloe about her reading list, James about the school robotics fair. Nothing really landed. And then, casually, I asked, "So, when is the big trip?" Nicole paused with her fork, midair. Garrett looked down at his plate. I smiled softly. "Disneyland, right? You said you'd be going in the spring." Nicole set her fork down gently and dabbed at her mouth with her napkin. "Oh, yes. It's next weekend, actually." "Wow," I said, still smiling. "That's coming up quick." We've had it planned for a while, Garrett added, not quite meeting my eye. We rented a van, 15-seater. That sounds like fun, I said, keeping my tone light. That'll fit everyone then. Nicole exchanged a glance with Garrett, the kind of glance people give each other when they've rehearsed something, and now it's time to say the line. Well, she said we're actually full. It's Garrett and me, the kids, my parents, my sister and her kids, plus Tanya and her husband. Her voice trailed off as she did the math in her head like it would explain everything. Yeah, it adds up. 14 of us already. Garrett chimed in quickly. It's a tight squeeze already. And Mom with your knees. Honestly, we didn't think the long drive would be comfortable for you. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I needed to keep my mouth from shaking. Oh, I understand. Of course, I wouldn't want to slow anyone down. Nicole tilted her head. You know we'll send lots of photos. I swallowed. That's sweet of you. And just like that, the conversation shifted. James asked for more juice. Chloe asked if the hotel would have a pool. I sat there still holding my fork, the bite of rice cooling on my tongue, the warmth drained from my face. I knew what had just happened. They hadn't forgotten to invite me. They had decided I didn't belong. Later that evening, after the dishes were done and the house was quiet again, I noticed Nicole had left her shawl draped over the back of the dining chair. I picked it up to fold it neatly before setting it aside, and as I did, a folded piece of paper slipped from its folds and landed on the floor. I bent down, picked it up, and hesitated before unfolding it. It was the van rental confirmation. One printed page. Passenger list included. I read each name one by one. Garrett, Nicole, James, Chloe, Nicole's parents, Nicole's sister and her 2 kids, Tanya and her husband. 14 names, which meant 1 seat still remained. 1 empty seat. I read the list again slower this time. There was no mistake. Tanya wasn't a close family member. She was Nicole's cousin from out of state, someone I'd only met once in passing at a birthday party. But she was going. Tanya made the list. There was room. There had always been room. Just not for me. I stood in the kitchen holding that paper, suddenly aware of how still the house was. The only sound came from the clock above the stove ticking steadily forward, like it knew something I didn't. Like it had been waiting for me to catch up. I placed the paper on the counter and turned off the kitchen light. The glow from the hallway lamp cast shadows on the floor. 1 for each empty chair. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours. I thought about every ride at Disneyland I wouldn't be on, every group photo. I wouldn't appear in every ice cream shared that I wouldn't be offered a lick of. But most of all, I thought about the seat. That 1 seat, not the one in the van, the one in their lives. It wasn't that there wasn't room. It was that they'd already decided where I belonged. And it wasn't with them. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed with the lights off, the ceiling fan humming above me like a soft, persistent reminder that the world kept moving, even when your heart sat still. The booking paper was still in the drawer beside my tea towels, folded twice over like a wound, tucked behind something domestic and harmless. I knew the names on that list by heart now. I could recite them in order like a school roll call. Garrett, Nicole, James, Chloe, Nicole's parents, her sister, her sister's kids, Tanya and her husband, 14 names. A perfect head count. 15 seats. 1 seat left. Just 1. It wasn't that there wasn't room, it was that there wasn't the intention. There's a difference, between being overlooked and being left out. One is clumsy, the other is careful, and I had the distinct cold realization that I hadn't been forgotten. I had been excluded quietly and intentionally, the way you skip an ingredient from a recipe when you know the flavor it brings, and you simply don't want it. The next morning, I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing out the coffee pot. It was barely light out, but I hadn't been able to stay in bed any longer. The silence was thicker in the mornings. Not lonely exactly, but sharp, like it noticed things you didn't want it to. The salmon smell still lingered faintly from the night before. I cracked open the window, letting in a breeze that carried a hint of late winter chill. It was March, after all, the kind of month that can't decide if it wants to stay gray or flirt with spring. I poured myself a cup of tea, then sat at the table. Alone again, just watching the steam curl in the air. I'd made enough tea for two. I always did. I never stopped. It used to be for Howard. After he passed, I kept the ritual because it made me feel like part of something still existed. But that morning I realized I had no one left to serve the second cup to. I sat and let it grow cold. I opened the drawer beside me, took out the booking paper again, and just stared at it. Not for answers, there were none left to uncover. But to hold the evidence. I wasn't imagining things, I wasn't being sensitive. My name simply wasn't there. I placed the paper on the table and looked at it beside the photo frame that always sat there. A picture of Garrett at age 5 standing in front of our old swing set with Howard holding him by the waist. They were both grinning, Garrett missing 2 front teeth. I remember taking that photo. Howard had just pushed Garrett so high the boy screamed not in fear but in delight. And when he landed, I said, "You looked like you could fly." "Only if Dad catches me again," Garrett had replied. Now he was flying all right, just not looking back to check if I was still there. I wandered through the house that day, not with purpose, but like I was following my own shadow. Every corner held some echo of what once was. The hallway wall still had the faint outlines of the pencil marks I used to track Garrett's height. I never painted over them. Some of the lines had names scribbled beside them. 7 Samo. Field Day, 9. Spelling Bee Champ. 11. First bike crash. The higher they went, the fainter the memories became. In the spare room, which used to be his childhood bedroom, I kept a few boxes. Not many, just the things he didn't take when he moved in with Nicole. An old baseball glove, some school trophies, a shoebox full of comic books. I ran my hand along the top of the box, felt the dust settle into my fingerprints. None of it had been touched in years. In the living room above the mantel hung the last family photo we ever took. Thanksgiving maybe 5 years ago, before Nicole started suggesting they alternate holidays with her family. Before things began to feel like a negotiation. Everyone was smiling in the picture, even me, especially me. But looking at it now, I couldn't tell if it was a real smile or the kind you put on when you know you have to. And in the corner of that photo, almost easy to miss. I saw it. I had my hand on Nicole's shoulder. I didn't remember doing that. I stared at my hand. It looked awkward, even from the photograph, like I was reaching for closeness that wasn't truly there. I took the photo off the wall. Not out of anger, just curiosity. Behind it, taped to the back of the frame, was a note from Chloe, one of those sticky notes she used to love writing on. It said, "Grandma makes the best cookies. Better than Dad. Don't tell him." My heart ached. Not because she'd said it, but because I couldn't remember the last time she wrote me a note. I sat back down at the table, placed the booking list beside the photo and the sticky note, and stared at the 3 pieces of paper. The truth they didn't say aloud. The smile I didn't remember giving. And the love that used to come so freely. People assume neglect always looks like shouting, like slammed doors or harsh words. But no, sometimes it looks like being left off a list, being scheduled last, being told, "We just assumed you'd be busy." It's absence masquerading as politeness. It's decisions made quietly, just not with you in mind. I thought of all the Sundays I had cooked for them, the meals, the cleaning, the careful timing, the salmon that always came out just right, the desserts I planned based on Chloe's favorites, the rice shaped into little molds, so James would think it was fancy. I remembered the birthdays when they texted instead of called, the Mother's Day when they showed up with store-bought muffins and no card, the time they invited Nicole's parents to a family barbecue but never mentioned it to me until I walked in with a casserole and saw an extra table set. None of these things alone would break a person, but together they wove a tapestry of slow erasure. And now this trip, This one van, this one empty seat that could have held me, but didn't. They hadn't forgotten me. They had weighed my presence and decided it didn't add value. That's what stung. Not the oversight, the decision. That evening I didn't cook. I didn't set the table. I didn't even heat the leftovers. I poured a bowl of cereal, sat in front of the window, and watched the sun slide behind the trees, coloring everything in amber silence. I wasn't grieving. I'd done that already. I'd grieved Howard. I'd grieved my old life. No, this was something else. This was clarity. And clarity is quiet. It doesn't rage. It just removes all doubt. I wasn't being paranoid. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't part of the plan anymore. And deep down, I knew they hadn't forgotten me. They had let me go. The morning after my realization, after the papers, the photographs, the silence, I did something I hadn't done in years. I reached for my old address book. It's a leather-bound thing worn soft at the corners, stuffed with slips of paper and notes in faded ink. Most of the names inside belonged to people who had either moved away or passed on. But near the back, tucked in between entries for U and V, was a name I hadn't said out loud in a very long time, Eunice Crowley. We had met in college, both education majors, both stubborn in our own ways. She had a laugh like gravel and a wardrobe of mismatched scarves that she claimed brought her good luck. Life took us in different directions. I married Howard and stayed local. She moved to the coast after her second divorce and wrote me once to say she'd finally made peace with the ocean. I'd meant to visit her. I never did. But that morning, as the sunlight pooled on the kitchen floor and the smell of old lemon tart still lingered, I picked up the phone and dialed the number scribbled in the margin. It rang twice before a familiar husky voice answered. "Elaine Rourke," she said, not even asking who it was. Well, I'll be damned, we talked for nearly an hour. About nothing about everything. About knees that crack now and grandchildren who say whatever too much, and the way the world keeps moving even when you feel stuck in place. I told her I'd been thinking of coming out to the coast, just for a few days. Eunice didn't ask why. She didn't prod. She just said, "I've got an extra room and a kettle that whistles when it's ready. Come on down." I packed light, just one suitcase and a satchel with my knitting and a half-finished book I wasn't sure I'd ever finish. I told Garrett I was going out of town for a few days. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. No questions. No doubt might know where, no why. That told me more than any long conversation could have. The drive to Sunset Bay took almost 3 hours. I passed long stretches of empty highway billboards, advertising peach cobbler and tax attorneys and small towns that felt like they'd been forgotten by time. The kind of places where the gas stations still had handwritten signs and the waitresses knew everyone's name. Sunset Bay wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of place that made travel blogs. But it had charm. Small bungalows with white fences, flower pots hanging from every porch, and the smell of salt and fried shrimp carried in from the docks. The ocean greeted me before I saw it. Its scent, its sound, the distant cries of gulls over water. Eunice greeted me at her porch with a towel over one shoulder and a glass of sweet tea in each hand. "You look tired," she said. I laughed. "I am." "Well, she said you came to the right place to forget who made you feel that way." Her home was modest, warm, full of books and mismatched mugs. The guest room had a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. We sat on the porch that first evening and watched the sun fall into the water like it had nowhere better to be. She didn't ask about Garrett. I didn't bring him up. But somewhere between refilling our tea and brushing a moth off the railing, I said, "They're going to Disneyland." Said the van was full. Eunice didn't flinch, just took a long sip and said, "Mine told me not to visit unless I called first." Said it stressed the dog. I blinked. "The dog." She nodded. Apparently, surprise visits ruin his routine. We both laughed, but there was weight behind it. In the days that followed, we did small things that felt big. We walked the boardwalk in the morning, our steps slow and steady. She took me to a seafood shack run by a couple who'd been married 60 years and still bickered like teenagers. We bought shells at a beachside shop, even though neither of us had any use for them. We watched elderly couples dance in the square on Friday night, their feet shuffling their smiles unbothered. And we talked. Not about motherhood in a nostalgic way, but in a raw one. About the quiet ache of being needed and then not. About how no one tells you the letting go is gradual and that it's not always mutual, that sometimes your children drift not because they're cruel but because you made it easy for them to forget how much you carried. Eunice looked at me one afternoon while we were sitting by the pier and said, "I spent 30 years building a home for my son. And when he left, I realized I had built it so well. He didn't think to leave me a spare key." I didn't answer. I just reached for her hand. We sat there, two women whose lives had been rearranged gently but thoroughly, not with explosions but with tiny shifts, doors closing softly, invitations that never arrived, decisions made in rooms we weren't invited into. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel ashamed of being hurt. I didn't feel like I was overreacting, or too emotional, or demanding. I just felt human. That evening, as the sun dipped into the sea like it was being swallowed whole, I realized something I had spent years waiting to be included again. But maybe what I needed was to belong somewhere that didn't ask me to prove my worth. I looked at the ocean, endless and patient, and thought, maybe it was time to build something new. Not for them, but for me. I returned home from Sunset Bay with a suitcase full of clean laundry, half a seashell necklace I didn't remember buying, and a quiet in my chest that didn't feel quite so lonely anymore. It was still the same house. The same creaking front step, the same tulips stubbornly blooming by the fence, the same dusty air waiting to be disturbed. But something had shifted in me. I had left this place with my heart held together by habit. I came back with a steady understanding I may have built my life around others, but this house was still mine. For the first time in a while, I looked around my living room and noticed how much of me still lived here. The quilt folded at the end of the couch, stitched by my own mother. The clock, Howard had fixed a dozen times, always insisting it was off by a soul, not a second. The bookshelf stuffed with novels I'd never finish, and cookbooks with splattered pages that told their own stories. This home carried my fingerprints in every corner. It remembered who I was, even when the people I loved seemed to forget. The following morning, I opened the file cabinet in the hallway closet. A creaky metal drawer I hadn't sorted in over a year. I was looking for the deed to the house, not because I doubted it was mine, but because I suddenly needed to see it. To feel the paper. To know in black and white that I still had something no one else could claim or take or rearrange. It took me a while to find it. Beneath tax forms and appliance warranties and Howard's old VA records, I found the folder labeled Home. I opened it, and there it was. My name on the deed signed, back when we paid off the mortgage in full. A sharp memory surfaced then. Howard bringing home a bottle of cheap champagne and saying, "We own every squeaky floorboard now." I smiled at that. But tucked behind that deed was something I didn't recognize. A printed document from a local bank. Garrett's Bank. A line of text caught my eye. Application for line of credit, secured by residential property potential collateral, and beneath it the address. My full address. In Garrett's file, without my signature, without my knowledge. I felt the paper go cold in my hands. The document wasn't finalized. It had been denied, apparently, but the fact that he'd used my house even speculatively, even unofficially, without a single conversation, it made my stomach twist. I sat down at the kitchen table, that same table where I'd served him dinner every Sunday, and laid the document flat like I was interrogating it. I read it twice, 3 times. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it was a clerical error. But no. There it was, in his handwriting, in his initials. My house. I reached for my phone and called Alan Truss, the attorney who helped us set up our estate plans after Howard passed. Alan was semi-retired now, more likely to be found on a golf course than in a courtroom, but he still answered my call on the third ring. "Elaine," he said warmly, "haven't heard from you in a while. What can I help you with?" I told him what I found. I read the exact wording. He was quiet for a moment. "Legally," he said carefully, "your property can't be used as collateral unless you sign off on it. If you haven't signed anything, then it holds no legal standing." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. But he added, "It's not uncommon for people to list potential collateral when applying for preliminary approval. Sometimes they do it assumptively. It doesn't mean intent to harm necessarily. Assumptively. That word sat with me all day. What did my son assume, that I'd never leave this house, that one day it would be his, that I was already fading from ownership just as I had from their priorities? He had moved from showing up late to Sunday dinners to penciling in my home as an asset. And all of it, quietly, without confrontation, without clarity. It didn't make me angry, not exactly. I didn't feel the heat of rage in my chest. What I felt was cooler, sharper. I felt like I'd been watched as I watered my plants, baked their favorite meals, folded linens for sleepovers, and silently folded out of their future plans. They assumed I'd stay. They assumed I'd be here. They assumed the house would wait, that I would wait, that I would be waiting. But I wasn't waiting anymore. That night, I poured myself a glass of red wine, not the usual tea, and sat on the back porch watching the wind stir through the trees like fingers through hair. The stars blinked above me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel bound to this place. I didn't feel rooted by duty or habit or guilt. I thought about Sunset Bay, about Nice, about the feeling of walking beside someone who had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. And I thought, not for the first time, maybe I could let go. Maybe this house, as much as it meant to me, didn't have to be part of my story forever. Not if it had become someone else's assumption, because I may have built this house with love, but I no longer lived here with it. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to move on before they ever got the chance to move me out. I didn't make a big decision all at once. There was no grand moment, no dramatic revelation. It was more like a slow, steady tide, the kind that creeps in quietly, reshaping the shore without ever making a sound. One morning I opened the front closet to put away my coat and found myself staring at the empty space where Garrett's winter jacket used to hang. He hadn't needed it in years. But somehow I'd kept that old corduroy thing in there, as if it had earned its place like a permanent guest. That morning I touched the sleeve, then gently folded it into a box. Something had shifted. Something inside me had accepted that I wasn't just living in a house. They were too, and in ways they didn't even realize. By the end of that week, I called a local realtor named Deborah Weems. She was close to my age, had a kind voice, and no need to sell me anything I wasn't ready to let go of. I didn't even need to explain much. "I'm thinking of listing," I said simply. There was a pause on her end of the line. Then, "Are you sure?" I nodded. I think I already was. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. She agreed to keep things discreet. No signs in the yard, no public listing until I was ready. Just quiet inquiries, quiet showings, quiet steps towards something I wasn't quite ready to name. In the meantime, I began to pack. At first, I thought I'd only box up the essentials. But what started as a drawer here, a shelf there, soon turned into something deeper. I wasn't just organizing things. I was unspooling a life. I wrapped each item not just in newspaper, but in memory. The gravy boat we only used at Thanksgiving. The one Garrett dropped once and glued back together with crooked pride. Howard's cufflinks still in the small velvet box that smelled faintly of Old Spice. The tea tin from Paris I'd bought myself when no one remembered my 60th birthday. The Afghan Chloe had dragged around like a cape when she was 4. The house had stories embedded in it, in the floors that creaked in specific spots, in the dented corner of the hallway table from when James ran too fast in his socks, in the light switch in the laundry room that never worked unless you jiggled it just right. None of it would mean anything to the next family who lived here. But it meant everything to me. Still, I let it go. I kept what mattered. The letters, the photographs, a few books with notes scribbled in the margins, and donated what I didn't need. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I'd come to understand something essential. I wasn't walking away from a home. I was walking towards something else. I wrote 2 letters. One for James, one for Chloe, handwritten, folded, neatly sealed in envelopes with stickers I found in an old kitchen drawer. Not farewell notes, just truth. To James I wrote, "You're growing into a man with a strong mind. Don't forget to carry a kind heart alongside it. I won't be here to remind you every week, but I'll still be proud from wherever I end up." To Chloe, "You always noticed things others missed. Never lose that. Keep reading. Keep asking questions. And always remember, lemon tart tastes best with people who see you." I didn't blame them. They were children. They followed where they were led, but I needed them to know. My leaving wasn't abandonment. It was release from the weight of being tolerated, from the ache of being barely seen. I tucked both letters into a small wooden box and placed it on the mantel beside a note that simply said, "These are for your hearts, not your hands." The day the realtor called to say there was an interested buyer, I stood in the living room and looked around. The furniture was still there. The walls still held their neutral beige. But something had changed. The air didn't carry the same echoes anymore. The memories were still in the house, but they no longer lived here. They lived in me. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the wind blow through the maple in the front yard, the one Howard planted the year Garrett was born. It had grown tall, its branches reaching in every direction, unbothered by the boundaries of the yard. I took a photo of it. Not to remember the tree, but to remember what it felt like to choose something for myself. Finally, I wasn't leaving in anger. I wasn't leaving to punish. I was leaving because I could. Because no one else had written me into their plans. So I wrote my own. I locked the front door for what might have been the last time, turned the key and placed it in an envelope. I didn't take the casserole dishes. I didn't take the guest towels. I didn't take the good china. What I took was quieter, deeper. I took my dignity. I took my peace. I took the version of me that had waited too long for someone else to notice I was fading. I didn't take the house with me, but I took everything that ever made it home. It was late afternoon when Garrett turned onto the familiar street, the one with the uneven sidewalk, the old oak tree that always dropped acorns too early in the season, the rust-colored mailbox that leaned a little to the left. Chloe was asleep in the back seat, her head tipped to the side with a soft snore escaping her tiny lips. James was glued to his phone thumbs, moving rapidly, earbuds in, oblivious. Nicole sat quietly in the passenger seat, sunglasses still on, even though the sun was beginning to sink. Garrett exhaled. The trip to Disneyland had been fine, chaotic, expensive, loud. The kids had fun. Nicole had coordinated every detail like a general. But now all he wanted was to drop off the luggage, let the kids unwind, and maybe, if he was lucky, have one of his mom's Sunday casseroles waiting in the fridge. Chicken and spinach with that buttery breadcrumb topping. He pulled into the driveway without thinking. The motion was automatic. One hand on the wheel, one foot easing into the brake, the van rolling to its familiar stop near the cracked section of cement that had been there since he was 12. But something felt off. It took him a moment to realize what. The porch light wasn't on. That was unusual. Mom always left the light on, especially when she knew they were coming home. A kind of ritual she never gave up, no matter how many times he said, "You don't need to do that anymore." Nicole looked up from her phone. Is it just me, or are those not her curtains? Garrett blinked, leaned forward, squinting at the front window. The lace curtains his mom always kept tied with yellow ribbon were gone. In their place were plain gray blinds pulled halfway down. He opened the door slowly, stepping out of the van. The air smelled the same. Grass clippings, a hint of honeysuckle. But the atmosphere felt hollow. He walked up to the porch. No welcome mat, no little ceramic frog that Chloe had painted in kindergarten. The geraniums were missing from the planter boxes. Even the door had a different knocker. Sleek brushed nickel where there had once been brass. Still, he knocked. Once, then twice. A pause. Then the door opened. Not to his mother. A woman in yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt. Her blonde hair tied back, a toddler balanced on her hip, looked at him with polite confusion. "Can I help you?" Garrett stumbled over his words. I'm sorry. This was my mom's house. Elaine Rourke." The woman shifted the child on her hip and nodded. "Oh, Elaine. Yeah, we just bought the place last week. She moved out really fast. Left the place spotless, though. My husband couldn't believe it. Even the cabinets were wiped down. Dream seller." Garrett opened his mouth, then closed it again. The woman gave a sympathetic smile. She left a couple of envelopes. One said, "For the mail carrier." "Maybe she left something for you, too." He shook his head slowly. No, it's fine. Thanks." The woman nodded once and gently closed the door. Garrett stood there for a moment, frozen in place. Nicole had joined him by then, arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Did she just say your mom moved out?" Garrett nodded. "I guess she sold the house. Without telling you." He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed. The screen showed Mom. Cell. It rang 4 times. Then her voice came on. "Hi, this is Elaine. If I didn't pick up, I'm probably outside enjoying something quiet. Leave a message or don't. Either way, I hope you're well." Beep. He cleared his throat. "Mom. Hey, we're back. I'm at the house. Or I guess what used to be the house. Just wondering what's going on. Can you call me back?" He ended the call and stared at the screen like it might offer him more. Nicole's voice broke the silence. "She really didn't say anything to you?" "No. Nothing. She said she was going out of town for a few days. But I thought that meant, I don't know, visiting someone? Not this." Behind them, James had climbed out of the van, earbuds now around his neck. "Why are we just standing here?" Garrett turned slowly. "We're not going inside." James frowned. "Why not?" Chloe stirred in the back seat. "Are we home?" Garrett opened the van door for her. "Not exactly, sweetheart." He lifted her out carefully. She looked around with sleepy eyes, scanning the porch, the windows, the unfamiliar trim. "Where's Grandma?" Garrett hesitated. She's not here right now." Chloe blinked. "But she said she'd save me lemon tart." Garrett's throat tightened. Nicole placed a hand on his arm. "What do you want to do?" He didn't know. He truly didn't know. So they got back in the car. No one said much on the drive home. Later that night, Garrett sat on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, still no response. He scrolled through past messages, birthday reminders, on my way texts, one photo of Chloe wearing a paper crown sitting at Grandma's table, crumbs of tart on her cheek. He typed another message. "Can we talk? I didn't know you were leaving." But he didn't send it, because somewhere deep inside he realized maybe that was the point. She hadn't slammed a door. She hadn't made a scene. She hadn't said a word. She had just left, with grace, with finality, with every casserole dish, every cloth napkin, every last quiet disappointment folded and packed and carried with her. Somewhere she was sipping tea, or walking near the water, or maybe watching the sunset with a woman named Unyunas who understood what it meant to be erased in small daily ways. And she wasn't answering the phone, not because she was punishing him, but because after a lifetime of picking up, she'd finally decided to listen to herself. The cottage I rented was small, nestled along the edge of Sunset Bay with clappered siding and windows that creaked in the breeze. It had a garden out back that needed taming, and a front step that wobbled slightly to the left. The place was honest. Not polished, not perfect, but it didn't pretend to be anything else. I liked that. The first morning there, I made tea with water that took forever to boil. The kettle was old, the kind that whistles like it's surprised by its own voice. I stood by the window, mug in hand, watching as the ocean mist rolled across the gravel road. The air smelled of salt and rosemary. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice, then nothing. Silence used to make me nervous. I used to fill it with chores, with hums, with just checking in texts. But here, the silence didn't accuse me of anything. It just let me be. For the first few days, I didn't do much. I unpacked slowly. I read the same page of a book 3 times before realizing I was watching birds instead. I ate cereal for dinner not because I had to, but because I didn't feel like explaining myself to a stovetop. Somehow the days passed. Gentle, uneventful. I didn't miss the noise, not the kind I'd grown used to, the clatter of dishes left behind the hollow pleasantries at the dinner table, the way Nicole checked her watch mid-meal. No, I missed other things. I missed the version of me who had once felt essential. Who knew what time the kids liked their juice? Who remembered everyone's favorite pie? Who got phone calls instead of group texts? But even that ache began to quiet. One morning, while walking along the boardwalk, I noticed a sign outside a small gallery, Watercolor Wednesdays. Beginners welcome. I stood there for a moment, then kept walking. The next Wednesday, I passed it again. This time I paused longer. By the 3rd week, I stepped inside. The studio smelled of turpentine and dried lavender. A handful of women sat around a long wooden table, each with a brush in hand, their faces bent over paper like they were listening to something secret. A woman with bright red glasses looked up. New. "I think so," I said. She smiled. "Pick a spot. We've got extra everything." I sat at the far end near the window. In front of me, a cup of water, a palette, a pad of thick paper. I hadn't painted in decades. Not since I used to help run the after-school art club back when Garrett was in elementary school. Back when I'd stay late with glue on my sleeves and glitter in my hair. I dipped the brush into water, then color. It trembled a little in my hand. I didn't know what to paint. So I started with what I missed. A table, 5 chairs, then 4. Then just 1. I added shadows gently like I was whispering with the brush. Then slowly I painted in a 2nd chair, not across from the first but slightly angled, empty too. But I let the sunlight fall on that one. Let it catch the corner of the chair and spill across the floor. The instructor walked by, paused, and said nothing. I was glad. That night I pinned the painting on the corkboard in the kitchen. It wasn't beautiful, but it was mine. I wasn't trying to say anything with it. Not to Garrett. Not to Nicole. Not to the grandkids. It was just a reminder that I was still here. That even if no one asked for me, no one saved me a seat, I could still show up for myself. There was a kind of freedom in that. Quiet, yes, but whole. Some evenings I walked to the shoreline and watched the horizon turn lavender. I didn't miss being part of someone's schedule. I didn't miss the texts that arrived too late or the calls that never came. I didn't even miss the house. What I missed was being known. And in this new quiet, I was starting to remember I used to know myself. So I was starting there. Not with noise, not with announcements, not with a grand reinvention. Just 1 paintbrush, 1 empty chair, and the choice to light it gently. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. It was nestled between a grocery flyer and a reminder from the electric company. I almost missed it. Tucked quietly, almost shyly at the bottom of the stack. The return address was handwritten, the letters slightly uneven, the kind of scrawl that hasn't yet been shaped by adult habits. It was Chloe's handwriting. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, holding the envelope like it might vanish if I moved too quickly. Then I set everything else aside and walked to the kitchen table, the same one where I'd painted the empty chairs, and opened it with careful fingers. There was no punctuation, just flowing thoughts the way children speak when they're too full of emotion to edit. Dear Grandma, we came to your house, but you weren't there. A lady with a dog opened the door and said you moved. Dad looked surprised and kind of confused. Mom was quiet for a long time. I was sad. Not mad, just sad. I thought maybe you were mad at us, but I think maybe not. I think maybe you were just tired of waiting. I looked at the kitchen. Your chair was gone. But the table still looked like it was waiting for you. I drew you a new one. If you ever want to come back, I'll keep your seat ready. Love. Chloe. P.S. I still like lemon tart. Just not the store kind. Folded into the letter was a drawing. Crayon lines on lined paper. A dining table with 5 chairs, 4 filled with scribbled stick figures. One was empty with little beams of yellow surrounding it. Like sunlight, or a quiet welcome. I didn't cry right away. I sat there, the letter spread open, tracing her words with my eyes again and again. Then I held the page to my chest and let the tears come, not from sadness, but from something deeper. That place inside a mother's heart where grief and gratitude hold hands. I hadn't realized how much I needed to be seen. Not by Garrett, not even by Nicole, but by someone who didn't need me to prove I still mattered. Chloe's letter didn't ask me to come back. She didn't demand an explanation. She didn't say why, she just noticed and reached out. I didn't write her back right away. I let a few days pass. I let her words sit with me, warm and still. But one morning, as the mist lifted from the coastline and the gulls called out over the docks, I reached for one of the blank cards I'd bought on a whim at the little bookstore downtown. The front was plain, just soft paper, thick and textured. I dipped my brush in color and began to paint. 2 chairs, wooden, simple, facing the sea, no people in them, no names, but the light was there, soft and golden, stretching across the sand like morning had remembered where to find them. Inside the card, I didn't write much. Dear Chloe, I'm not far, just listening to waves for a while. I kept your picture, and I saw the sunlight. Love always, Grandma. I sealed the envelope, wrote her name in steady cursive, and mailed it to my old house. I didn't know if she'd get it. I didn't know if someone would open it for her. But that didn't matter, because sometimes the act of reaching back is enough. Sometimes you don't need a full embrace, just one hand extended quietly holding your name. I no longer needed the whole table. I no longer needed the head seat. But a child had offered me a chair bathed in sunlight, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I still had a place in someone's story. Summer in Sunset Bay didn't arrive with a grand announcement. It just settled in. The days grew longer, the breeze warmer, and the scent of salt began to mix with blooming jasmine from the neighbors' gardens. The town, once sleepy and quiet, began to hum with small seasonal awakenings. Windows thrown open, porch chairs dusted off, and boats returning from winter rest. I had found my rhythm by then. Not a schedule, not a purpose, just rhythm. I woke when I wanted, usually with the light, sometimes later. I let the kettle whistle longer than necessary, let my tea steep while I stood barefoot on the back step, letting the cool boards press into my soles. I had started keeping a small journal, not with plans or goals, but with little noticings: the shape of a cloud, the shift in the tide line, the way birds tilted their heads when they drank from puddles. I didn't tell anyone where I was. I didn't post photos. I didn't check birthdays on social media. I didn't send holiday cards. But every few weeks I sent Chloe a postcard. At first they were simple, a watercolor of the shoreline, a sketch of a wind chime swaying over my porch. I didn't sign them with explanations. Just Grandma in the bottom corner and sometimes a note. The sea is extra green today. Or, There's a bird here who hops instead of flies. Reminds me of you. I didn't know if she got them. I didn't ask. That wasn't the point. I wasn't writing to pull her toward me. I was writing to hold a thread, a gentle one. Just enough to remind us both I hadn't unraveled entirely. And then, in early July, my phone buzzed with a message I didn't expect. We're coming to Sunset Bay for a few days. Nicole found a rental. Can we see you? The text was from Garrett. No apologies, no explanations. Just that simple question, can we see you? I read it 3 times. The first time I felt my chest tighten, not from pain but from something like disbelief. The second time I noticed the phrasing. Can we... not... we'd like to not... we miss you just... can we... like asking permission from someone they hadn't considered needing it before? The third time I laughed. Not cruelly, not bitterly, just softly. Because it was strange how peace made space for clarity. I didn't reply. Not then. That evening I took my usual walk along the boardwalk, the one that led to the quiet end of the beach where hardly anyone went. It was nearly sunset. The sky was soft gold melting into blue. The air carried that summer warmth that sits on your skin like silk. I reached the bench near the dunes, the one half sunk into the sand, crooked and worn smooth by time. It was my favorite. That day someone was already sitting there. She was older than me, I think, small and sturdy with a long cardigan over her shoulders and a wide-brimmed straw hat tilted low. Her cane rested beside her leg. She didn't look up when I approached. I paused, unsure if I should keep walking. But then she shifted just slightly and patted the bench beside her. I sat down. We didn't speak. Not a word. She watched the ocean like it was telling her something only she could understand. I joined her silence, let it wrap around us like a shawl. We sat that way for almost half an hour. She never asked why I was there. I never asked why she was. And in that quiet, one shared without expectation or performance, I realized something I hadn't been able to say aloud. I didn't need to be understood. I didn't need to explain why I left, or why I didn't pick up the phone, or why I'd let my house become someone else's kitchen, and someone else's hallway, and someone else's mortgage. What I needed was this: space, stillness, a bench shared with a woman who asked nothing from me. When I got home, I boiled water. The kettle whistled its usual startled song. I poured 2 cups of tea, set one down for myself. Then, without thinking too hard, I placed a second cup on the other side of the table. Not because I expected anyone. Not because Garrett had earned the seat back. Not even because Chloe might come someday. But because I wanted the possibility to exist. The next morning I wrote Garrett back. I'm here. I'm well. You're welcome to visit. But don't come out of guilt. Come if you want to share a quiet moment without needing me to explain where I've been. I hit send. Then I turned off the phone, not to shut him out, but because I no longer lived for the next reply. I had finally made peace with the fact that sometimes the people who once built their lives around you will walk away without noticing what parts of you they leave behind. And sometimes the only way to heal is to build something new without telling them you're doing it. That afternoon I walked to the art studio for the open painting hour. I started something new. A porch scene, 2 rocking chairs facing the sea. I didn't add people, just the shadows of someone who might have been there once. And in the corner I signed it, not with Mom, not with Grandma, just Elaine. Because after all this time I wasn't trying to be seen anymore. I was trying to see myself again. And that was more than enough. Have you ever felt like you were quietly being written out of your own family's story? Like the people you loved the most stopped saving you a seat at the table, without ever saying a word? Elaine's journey reminds us that sometimes walking away isn't about anger. It's about reclaiming your peace. It's about remembering that you are allowed to take up space, without needing to be asked. If this story touched something in you, If you've ever felt forgotten or quietly pushed aside, you're not alone. What would you have done if you were in Elaine's shoes? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, of quiet strength, unspoken heartbreak, and powerful redemption, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Your voice matters. And your presence here, it's seen. It's valued. Always.